Picture a mountain in the high Andes in the year 1573. The air is so thin it hurts to breathe, and the cold comes off the rock like something with teeth. At the foot of this mountain stands a man named Mateo, and into his cracked, calloused palm someone presses a single coin. It is still warm. It has just been struck from silver that came out of the mountain looming over his shoulder, and the metal holds the heat of the hammer that flattened it. The coin is ugly. It is not the perfect round disc you are imagining. It is a rough, irregular lump, hand-cut and hand-struck, with the lions and castles of the Spanish crown stamped slightly off-center. It is heavy for its size. And Mateo, who has never in his life owned anything worth this much, closes his fist around it. He does not know it yet, but he is holding the most important object of the next 200 years. That coin will leave his hand within the week. It will cross an ocean. It will pass through the fingers of merchants and kings and tax collectors and thieves. It will travel to a city on the other side of the planet that Mateo has never heard of and could never imagine. It will outlive him, and it will outlive his children, and it will outlive the empire that minted it. And long after everyone who ever touched it is dust, people will still be telling stories about it. This is the piece of 8, and almost everything you think you know about it is wrong. You think you know this coin. You have seen it in 100 stories. It is the treasure in the buried chest, the gold doubloon glinting in the sand, the thing the parrot screeches on the pirate's shoulder. Pieces of 8, pieces of 8. It is the most romantic object in the entire mythology of piracy, a little circle of adventure and danger, and X marks the spot. And that image is a costume, a very pretty costume draped over something far stranger and far darker than any pirate story. Because here is the truth. The piece of 8 was not pirate money. It was the closest thing the early modern world ever had to a single global currency. It was money that worked in Seville and in Boston and in the markets of Beijing. It was the first object in human history that was trusted by name and by weight on every inhabited continent at the same time. Pirates did not invent it, did not control it, and did not even particularly understand it. They just stole it, the way a flea steals blood, because it happened to be the richest thing moving across the oceans they prowled. So how did one ugly, hand-struck Spanish coin become the money of the entire world? Why did merchants in China, who wanted almost nothing Europe produced, accept this specific coin and no other? And what did it actually cost to mine the silver that filled the holds of those ships? Because the answer to that last question is the part the romance was invented to hide. To understand all of it, we have to go back to the mountain. In the middle of the 16th century, the world had a problem. Trade was exploding. New routes were opening across oceans that had never carried cargo before. Goods were flowing between continents in volumes no one had ever managed, but money had not caught up. Europe was chronically short of coin. Every kingdom minted its own currency, with its own weight and its own purity and its own arguments about what it was actually worth, and a merchant who crossed 3 borders might have to change his money 4 times and lose a little at every exchange. What the world was hungry for, without quite having the words for it, was a unit of value that everyone could agree on, a coin that meant the same thing everywhere. And then in 1545, an indigenous worker stumbled onto a deposit of silver in a cone-shaped mountain in what was then Upper Peru and is now Bolivia. The Spanish called the mountain Cerro Rico, the rich hill, and rich does not begin to cover it. This was not a vein of silver. This was a mountain that was, in places, very nearly made of silver. The deposits ran so pure that the earliest miners barely had to refine them. Word spread and people came, and within a few decades a city had grown up in the freezing thin air at over 4,000 meters of altitude, a city that should never have existed in such a brutal, unlivable place, and that grew anyway because of what was under it. At its height, the city of Potosi held something like 160,000 people, which made it one of the largest cities on the entire planet. Larger than London at the time, larger than Madrid. A roaring, freezing, lethal boomtown perched on a mountain of treasure at the top of the world. The numbers that came out of that mountain do not feel real. Over the centuries that the Spanish worked it, Cerro Rico produced silver measured not in kilograms, but in tens of thousands of tons. By some estimates, the Spanish-American mines flooded the world with more silver in 2 centuries than had existed in all of Europe before Columbus sailed. The phrase the Spanish used for something fabulously valuable was "vale un Potosi." It is worth a Potosi. The mountain became a synonym for wealth itself. And all of that silver had to become something. It had to become coin. And the coin it became was the piece of 8. Here is where the first surprise lands, and it is worth slowing down for, because it overturns the entire image you walked in with. The piece of 8 was not a treasure to be hoarded. It was a tool to be used. Its whole genius, the thing that made it conquer the planet, was that it was boring. It was reliable. It was the same everywhere. The Spanish called it the real de ocho, the piece of 8 reals, because it was worth 8 of the smaller silver coins called reals. And the crown did something with it that turned out to be quietly revolutionary. They standardized it. Every piece of 8, in theory, contained the same amount of silver at the same purity, struck under royal authority, guaranteed by the mark of the Spanish crown. You did not have to trust the man who handed it to you. You did not have to know his language or his religion or his king. You only had to recognize the coin. And once you recognized it, you could weigh your whole transaction against a fixed and trusted standard. That is a concept economists would later have a clean word for: fungibility. The quality of being interchangeable, one unit exactly as good as another, so that money becomes a frictionless medium that any stranger will accept from any other stranger. We take it completely for granted now. A dollar is a dollar is a dollar. But in the 16th century this was close to magic, and the piece of 8 was the first object to pull it off on a global scale. It even came with its own built-in change-making system. The coin was worth 8 reals, and people would physically cut it into pieces to make smaller payments. Cut it in half, you had 4 reals. Cut the half in half, 2 reals. Cut again. And you had a single eighth of the coin, a wedge of silver people called a bit. 2 of those wedges made a quarter of the whole coin, and that is the origin of a phrase Americans still half remember without knowing where it comes from. 2 bits. A quarter. The piece of 8 was so literally divisible that it left its fingerprints on a language that would be spoken on a continent the coin's makers never saw. But let us be honest about how these coins were actually made, because it was not elegant. The earliest pieces of 8 were not the neat milled discs of later centuries. They were called cobs, and they were brutal, rough, hand-produced things. A worker would cut a chunk off a bar of refined silver, trim it roughly to the correct weight, and a man with a hammer and a die would smash the design into it with a single blow. The results were lumpy and irregular and frequently off-center. They looked, to be frank, like garbage. And the world did not care because the world was not buying the appearance. The world was buying the silver and the guarantee. The ugliness was almost a feature. Nobody minted a fake piece of 8 to look pretty. They minted real ones to be trusted, and trust was the only thing that mattered. And turning the mountain silver into that trusted coin required one more ingredient. And this is where the story stops being clever and starts being terrible. It required mercury. To pull the silver out of the lower-grade Potosi ore, the Spanish used a process built around mercury, ground together with the crushed rock so that the mercury would bind to the silver and let it be separated out. It worked. It worked spectacularly. It is also one of the more efficient ways ever devised to poison a human being slowly, and that brings us to the second mountain in this story, the one nobody puts in the pirate movies. The mercury came from a mine called HFY, hundreds of miles to the north. And if Potosi was the rich hill, HFY was simply called the mine of death. Mercury vapor does terrible things to the human body. The men who breathed it developed tremors, lost their teeth, lost control of their limbs, suffered the slow neurological collapse the Spanish themselves came to call mal de azog, the sickness of the quicksilver. To be sent to Huancavelica was widely understood to be a death sentence with the date left blank. The two mines fed each other across the spine of the Andes. Silver came down from one, mercury came down from the other, and the engine that drove both of them ran on people. That engine had a name, the Meta. It was a system of forced labor draft, reorganized and turned into a vast industrial machine by a Spanish viceroy named Francisco de Toledo in the 1570s, building on older Andean labor traditions and twisting them into something far more lethal. Under the Meta, indigenous communities across an enormous region were required to send a portion of their men, by rotation, to work in the mines. They were dragged from their villages, marched for weeks across the mountains, and sent down into the dark. And the dark at Potosi was a vision of hell that contemporary witnesses struggled to describe. Men climbed down rickety ladders into shafts that went hundreds of feet into the freezing rock, then hauled bags of ore back up on their backs by the light of a candle tied to a finger or to their forehead. The temperature swung from freezing at the surface to suffocating heat below. Tunnels collapsed. Men fell. The candle smoke and the rock dust filled their lungs, and above ground the mercury waited. How many died is one of those questions where the honest answer is that we cannot know, and the estimates that have been offered run into figures so large they stop feeling like people and start feeling like weather. Whatever the true number, the testimony from the time is consistent and damning. A Spanish priest who saw the mines wrote of the mountain devouring men, of mothers maiming their own sons to keep them from the draft, of communities hollowed out by the endless demand for bodies. The mountain that the Spanish called rich, the local Quechua-speaking workers came to describe in language that translates as the mountain that eats men. That is what the piece of 8 actually weighed, not in grams of silver, in lives. Every one of those coins, including the warm one pressed into Mateo's hand at the foot of the mountain, came out of a system that treated human beings as fuel. And the coin kept moving. That was the whole point of the coin. It moved and it kept moving and it carried none of that with it. A piece of 8 in a merchant's hand in Amsterdam said nothing about Huancavelica. The silence was built in. So how did this coin, born of a mountain that ate men, become the trusted money of the entire planet? Because that is the genuinely astonishing part, and the cruelty and the achievement are tangled together so tightly you cannot pull them apart. The coins were gathered by the ton and loaded onto ships. The Spanish ran their treasure across the Atlantic in a convoy system, great fleets that assembled at ports along the Spanish Main, took on the silver, rendezvoused at Havana, and then ran the gauntlet of the open ocean back to Seville. These were the famous treasure fleets, and they were the richest things that had ever floated. A single fleet could carry silver worth a sum that genuinely strains comparison to anything in the modern world. The wealth of a mountain, sailing in wooden boxes across a sea full of storms and men who wanted it. And from Seville, the silver did not stop. This is the part that breaks people's mental map of history. A huge portion of the world's silver did not stay in Europe at all. It went east. It went to China. Because China in this period had a colossal and almost bottomless appetite for silver. The Chinese economy had moved towards silver as the basis for taxation and trade, and China simply did not produce enough of its own. So when Spanish silver appeared, China inhaled it. The Spanish even built a second, westward route to feed the demand directly. Galleons sailed from the Pacific coast of the Americas across the open ocean to the Spanish port of Manila, in the Philippines, where the silver was traded to Chinese merchants for silk and porcelain and spices. The piece of 8 became a familiar object in Chinese markets, so familiar that Chinese merchants would stamp their own marks onto coins they had tested and approved, covering some of them in so many little stamps that the original Spanish design nearly vanished under a crust of Chinese verification. Think about what that means. A coin struck by hand from the silver of a Bolivian mountain, carried to a Mexican port, sailed across the Pacific, and trusted in the markets of Ming and then Qing China. The same coin was simultaneously the standard money of Spanish America. a regular sight in the ports of the American colonies that would become the United States, and a known quantity in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in India, in the Mediterranean. It was, functionally, the world's reserve currency, and it held that position before anybody had the concept of a reserve currency. The world agreed on this coin the way it has rarely agreed on anything. And only now, with all of that established, does the pirate finally swagger onto the stage. Because of course pirates wanted it. The treasure fleets were the single greatest concentration of portable wealth on Earth, moving on predictable routes across waters that no navy could fully control. A man named Francis Drake made his reputation, and a substantial part of England's by raiding Spanish silver, famously capturing a treasure ship so heavy with bullion that it reportedly took days to transfer the haul. Decades later, a man named Henry Morgan terrorized the Spanish ports of the Caribbean, sacking the towns where the silver gathered and dragging away whatever he could carry. These were not myths. These men were real, and the silver they chased was real, and the pieces of eight in their plunder were real. But notice what the pirates were actually doing. They were not creating value. They were intercepting it. They were attacks, a violent and parasitic tax on a flow of wealth that existed entirely because of the trust that other people had built into that coin. The pirate is downstream of everything. Downstream of the mountain, downstream of the Meta, downstream of the fleets and the markets, and the centuries of accumulated faith in 8 reals of guaranteed silver. The romance got attached to the very last and least important link in the whole chain, the thief. And the coin kept moving, right out of the pirate's pocket and into the next transaction, indifferent to whose hand it had passed through. Now we get to the deepest part of the whole story, the thing the piece of 8 can teach you that almost nothing else can teach you so cleanly. And it is this: money is a story that enough people agree to believe. The silver in the coin was real, yes. Silver has weight and you can melt it, and it is genuinely scarce, and all of that matters. But the silver alone did not make the piece of 8 the money of the world. What made it work was that everyone agreed it would work. The Chinese merchant accepted it because he believed the merchant after him would accept it. The trust was the product. The metal was just the thing the trust was written on. And we know this is true because we can watch what happened when the same Spanish crown tried to run money on its authority alone, without the trust, and failed badly. Because Spain did exactly that. At home, struggling with the costs of endless war, the Spanish crown debased its everyday copper coinage, the money called vellon, churning out token coins, restamping old ones with new and higher values, inflating the supply to plug holes in the budget. And that money behaved nothing like the piece of 8. People hoarded the good coins and spat out the bad ones. Prices convulsed. The copper money was clipped and counterfeited and distrusted, and it generated a slow-rolling monetary crisis at the very heart of the empire. Same crown, same lions and castles, same royal authority stamped right onto the metal, and the market simply refused to believe in it because the belief had been broken. That is the proof. Authority did not make the piece of 8. Credibility did. The crown could command its subjects to accept the copper, and they evaded it at every turn. But nobody had to command anybody to accept the piece of 8, because the piece of 8 had earned something the copper never had. It had earned trust by being reliable, coin after coin, decade after decade, in every market on Earth. And here is the irony that sits on top of that irony, the one that should make the whole thing land. Spain, the country that owned the mountain, that controlled the single richest source of silver in the history of the world, that minted the coin every other nation hungered for, went bankrupt. Repeatedly. The crown defaulted on its debts again and again across this period because the silver did not stay. It poured in through Seville and poured straight out again to the bankers and creditors and armies that the crown owed, a river of treasure running through Spanish hands without ever filling them. Spain held the source of the world's money and could not hold on to money. The silver was a story Spain told, and other people collected on the telling. The pirates, frankly, were amateurs. The real fortunes were made by the men with the ledgers, who understood that the trust was worth more than the metal, and never had to fire a shot to take it. The coin kept moving. It always kept moving. It moved past kings and through bankruptcies and out of the holds of sinking treasure ships, and the only thing that ever truly threatened it was the one thing no thief and no army could steal: the belief that held it up. Everything ends, including mountains. By the early 19th century, the system that had produced the piece of 8 was coming apart from several directions at once. The richest, easiest silver in Cerro Rico had been pulled out long before, and the mountain gave up its later treasure more grudgingly and at greater cost. The independence movements that swept across Spanish America in the early 1800s broke the empire that had run the mints and the fleets and the whole machine of extraction. The region that held Potosi became part of a new nation, and the old colonial order that had branded its coins with the lions and castles of Spain was finished. The fleet stopped sailing. The flow that had run for nearly 3 centuries dried to a trickle. But the coin did not die. It just shed its empire and kept going, because by then it was bigger than the country that made it. This is the legacy, and it is everywhere, hiding in plain sight. The young United States in its early decades did not have enough of its own coinage to run on, and so it ran on the piece of 8. The Spanish dollar circulated freely as money in the American colonies, and the early republic was trusted in everyday trade and remained legal tender in the United States until 1857, when an act of Congress finally retired it. The American dollar was modeled on it. The very word dollar traces back through a tangled European history to the kind of large silver coin the piece of 8 belonged to. And that symbol you type without a second thought, the dollar sign, the S with the stroke through it, most likely evolved from the way clerks wrote the abbreviation for the peso, the piece of 8, scrawled so often that the letters merged into a single mark. Every time you write that sign, you are drawing a ghost of a Spanish silver coin struck from a Bolivian mountain. And the language carried it too, 2 bits. For a quarter, an eighth of the coin doubled, sitting right there in old American speech. A fossil of a coin you could physically cut into 8 wedges. The piece of 8 wrote itself into the money, and the words of a civilization that the men who mined it could never have pictured. So consider, finally, where the coin ended up in our imagination. Not in a treatise on monetary history, not on a plaque at Potosi remembering the men the mountain ate. The piece of 8 ended up on a parrot's tongue. In 1883, a writer named Robert Louis Stevenson published a story about a treasure island and a one-legged sea cook, and on that sea cook's shoulder rode a parrot that screamed 2 words over and over, pieces of 8, pieces of 8, until those words became the single most recognizable sound in the entire mythology of piracy. That is where the coin lives now, in a children's adventure story, on a squawking bird. On the lunchboxes and the costumes and the theme park rides, a little circle of cartoon romance. The piece of 8 powered the cruelest economy of its age. It was minted from a mountain that consumed human beings by the thousand, refined with a mercury that poisoned the men who handled it, carried across oceans on the backs of forced labor and the threat of the lash. It built the first global market and the first global money, and it did it on a foundation of suffering that the shine of the silver was very good at hiding. And the world remembered none of that. The world remembered the parrot, which is, when you sit with it, the most honest thing the piece of 8 ever taught us. Money is a story people agree to believe, and the prettier the story, the better it hides what paid for it. The coin is still doing its oldest trick. It is still showing you the shine and keeping the mountain out of frame. The silver gets spent, the empires fall, the men who dug it are forgotten in the dark where they died. But the story, the bright and easy story, the one with the parrot and the treasure chest, that story keeps moving. It always keeps moving, just like the coin. If you made it all the way to the bottom of this mountain with me, you are exactly the kind of person who wants the real history under the myth. Subscribe, because every week I dig up the truth behind the stories we only think we know. And if you want to find out about the single shipwreck that scattered a fortune in pieces of 8 across the Florida coast, A fortune people are still pulling out of the sand 300 years later. That story is waiting for you on screen right now.